after 9/11, I lobbied him and many of the other executives, like, send me over there. Let me cover whatever's going to happen now. I've spent time with the Taliban. I've spent time with drug cartels. I developed a depression, and I wasn't self-aware enough to know I was depressed, but I was having trouble getting out of bed, and I felt like I had a low-grade fever all the time. And I did something incredibly dumb, which is that I started to self-medicate with recreational drugs, including cocaine, all of which occasioned a panic attack live on Good Morning America.
Well, Dan Harris, I had the opportunity to meet you at a dinner. We sat across the table from one another back pre-holiday, and I was really blown away by your story and your career and the things that are important to you. And of course, I've been an admirer of yours from afar for a long time because of your days at national and international stardom at ABC News. But I'd love to go back a little bit and share your story with our community about your journey. And I think it's a really interesting journey. And I know it's a cold weather journey because I think you're from the Boston area, but went to school in Maine and then started your professional career in Maine. But tell me about growing up, what it was like. I know your folks are clinicians in the medical world.
Yes, now both retired, but both of my parents were practicing physicians, part of the Harvard community. They were both teaching. They were both full professors at Harvard Medical School, and then also my dad was seeing patients as a radiation oncologist, and my mother was a pathologist and also an editor at the New England Journal of Medicine. So they were kind of big shot doctors. I was not very good at math or science, so
how did that happen?
I don't know how that happened. I have a little brother who is really good at math and is a very successful venture capitalist. But I ended up wearing makeup and talking to television cameras.
Just like mom and dad.
Exactly.
And so must have been an interesting time growing up in that intellectually stimulating community.
Yeah, it was very stimulating. They both of my parents were incredibly bright, and my brother's really bright, and I was by far the lowest wattage member of the family, and also probably the most problematic too. I was a bit of a tough child, especially in my adolescence. But it was. I had
I don't see the term
idyllic
street thug come up when you're on camera. I don't see that.
I flirted with street thuggery. I'm not going to lie to you. I definitely got arrested a bunch. I had a thriving weed business when I was a freshman in high school. So yeah, I had some problematic phases. And I just had the benefit of having really loving parents who loved each other, loved us as children, loved their work. And so I don't have much to complain about. Most of my problems were self-manufactured.
I bet even though your folks are retired, they still have an interest in what's going on. And I'm sure conversations today would involve a lot of discussions about what AI is going to do to the worlds of cancer treatment, oncology, therapeutics, et cetera. And I hope and expect we're on the cusp of some amazing breakthroughs there.
I am by far not an AI expert. I do try to follow it. Historically, I've always been late to technological trends. But when AI started to make news, I downloaded ChatGPT, paid for the subscription, and really try to interact a lot with AI. My layperson's understanding is that there's so much peril associated with AI, but there appears to be a lot of promise specifically in the medical space as it pertains to AI. Is this a story? Is this an area that you're tracking really closely?
I am, trying to run a day job, running a business. I think I become a convert this past 12 months, that this is as big and as real as we hear about. Of course, the stories that have broken in the last couple of days about DeepSeek and its consequences are amazing and hugely consequential in terms of what this will cost. But I'm convinced, Dan, that it's going to have far-reaching and very near-term impacts on pretty much everything we do. And that's scary and exciting at the same time. So not a technologist, but an interest in technology and how it's going to change our lives. And I read just yesterday that uh, Reid Hoffman, the prolific business founder in the Silicon Valley, including LinkedIn and other companies, PayPal, that he just made a big investment in a company, an AI company that will just do speed to market therapeutic testing on pharma applications. So when you get people like that making big $26 million bets, I think out of his own pocket yesterday, people who know what they're doing are sure that this is going to make a big difference. And it's clearly having a huge impact on your chosen career field and what can happen there. We'll get to that later. But so how did you wind up going up to Maine to go to school, I think at Colby?
Well, this is not flattering, but I was not the best student. I kind of pulled it together later in my high school career, but it was not, gonna. My parents had met and married at Stanford Medical School. I was not going to get into Stanford or anything like that. But my dad had a friend who was the dean at Colby, the dean of students, and so I met him, and my grades were good enough, and I got a little bit of assistance and got into Colby. Now Colby is very, very hard to get in. It's extremely prestigious, and it was a great school, but it wasn't quite as prestigious then as it is now.
Well, you hear that so often. I couldn't get in today.
I couldn't get in today. There's no question. So that's how I ended up at Colby, and it was a great school for me. And I took several semesters off. They were very liberal about taking. I took a semester abroad in Paris, and I took another semester at NYU Film School, and then I took another semester in Washington, learning how to cover politics. So I really was able to leverage this experience to get the resume I needed to come out of college and get into the media.
And was it in college that you lit on to the idea that media was going to be your career?
Yeah, I had quite immature notions that I wanted to get into either TV news or the movies, which in my mind seemed similar in that they were glamorous and potentially well paid. But they're totally unrelated. I mean, there's very little crossover.
Well, when I went cameras.
to NYU, there are cameras. That's about the end of the similarity right there. And I went to film school at NYU for a semester, and it became abundantly clear that I did not have much talent as a screenwriter or director. But I took a documentary class that I really liked, and I started to do some internships through Colby at TV stations, TV news stations, and really fell in love with that. And it's much less glamorous than the movies. It's especially for I started out in local news and in Maine, and then moved down to Boston, and it's gritty work. You're standing out in snowstorms or covering a fire or interviewing politicians. It's tough work, not very glamorous, except for the 15 seconds you're on camera.
But people don't realize what you had to do to get that information, to get on camera, to do it, and running around with a pad and trying to get people to stop in the middle of something important to get their name. There's a lot goes into that 15 seconds of airtime.
Exactly. But I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the idea that I could walk up to people, important people, and ask impertinent questions. I really fell in love with that.
And boy, what a career you've had. I know my friend Bob Diamond, who's very much a Colby guy, and brags about you being an alum of the school. And I know they awarded you a honorary doctorate for the work you've done in the body of your career. Amazing stuff. But tell us about that first job in Maine out of school.
Yeah, I graduated in 1993, which was a while ago. People may not remember this, but there was a recession at that time, and so it wasn't like a great job market.
There used to be recessions.
Yeah, exactly right. They're not modern. They're not modern developments. Sadly, it's the ebb and flow of the economy. And I got a job part time behind the scenes operating the camera at a little NBC station in Bangor, Maine, which is market. They rank the markets nationally by number, by size. So the higher the number, the smaller the market. So New York is number one. This was market 155, if memory serves. And I was operating the camera for the 5:30 news. And I just learned, that a lot of the technical stuff about operating cameras, but also how to write for broadcast. So it was also my job to write little stories for the anchor to read. And that really taught me a lot about the art and the skill of writing television and radio news.
What do you think was the attraction for you? You took that class in documentary filmmaking. What was it? Was there always a curiosity in you that was kindled by that experience in a documentary session? Is that what lit you into it? Is that what got you on that path?
I think that's exactly right. Over time, as I grew up and had a better sense of why I was so drawn to this career, and I was in TV news for 30 years almost. I think it was about being immersed in different worlds. So I ended up, as I moved up through the ranks in television news, traveling all over the world and being able to, I've spent time with the Taliban. I've spent time with drug cartels. I've spent time with people who bust pedophiles in Cambodia. I've spent time with the Dalai Lama. I've spent time, in Africa covering people who research gorillas. And to just be able, I've spent time with evangelical Christians, Scientologists, being able to jump into these different worlds and get an experience and then turn around and give other people just a little bit of a taste of how big and interesting a world this is. That was electrifying for me. And it's still, very core to what I do.
Tell us about your experience face to face with the Taliban.
So this was 2001, right after 9/11. I got
after 9/11. Wow.
So I got 9/11 happened. I was 30 years old, and I didn't have any kids. Wasn't married, and I volunteered to go overseas. I'd never covered combat. I'd never been to what we would developing country. I've never. I think I'd only been to like Western Europe.
Well, you've been to Paris.
Yeah, exactly. I've been to Paris. So where
were you working then?
I was working at ABC News.
National News?
Started at ABC. Yep. Started in Bangor, then I went to Portland, then I went to Boston. And then at age 28, I got to ABC News. So that was in the year 2000.
Where?
And then
where was the first ABC News job?
At the network in New York.
In New York, okay.
Yeah, where I fell under, I fell into the orbit of Peter Jennings, who was the anchor of ABC's World News Tonight, and just a massive figure in the world and in my life. And after 9/11, I lobbied him and many of the other executives, like, send me over there. Let me cover whatever's going to happen now. And they sent me to Pakistan. And while I was in Pakistan, one of our local producers said, hey, the Taliban is going to let a few reporters into Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, which is actively being bombed by the U.S. military. They're going to let some reporters in. Do you want to go? And I said, yes, I do.
Without thinking.
Absolutely without thinking. I did do some thinking. We had lots of discussions with the local team and with our bosses back in New York. But honestly, as soon as the words reached my ear that this was a possibility, I knew I wanted to go.
Wow.
So I was willing to have discussions, but I just knew I wanted to go.
Mm. And what was that like? Blindfolded? What kind of guides took you in? Where did you go? Did you sit on the floor?
Yeah, definitely sitting on the floor. And we were, it wasn't luxurious, but it wasn't hardship. We weren't blindfolded. We were taken on a bus down there. Back at this time, there were no paved roads. So driving from Pakistan into Kandahar, it was just this barely a dirt road. It was just rocky. It was this spine rattling ride in the middle of the night. And we stayed at these low-slung buildings on the outside of town, away from the bombs. We told the Pentagon where we were. It was just a few reporters. I was from ABC. There was another guy from CNN, another guy from BBC, just a small group of us. And I remember we had a chef who was cooking our meals who had one arm. And he was a Taliban fighter who had lost an arm and was now cooking. And then there were all these young guys, heavily armed young guys who just drove us around town and showed us what they wanted to show us. So they showed it was a propaganda tour, really.
Yep.
But we made the decision that my bosses and I made the decision. Hey, even though these guys have their agenda, they're trying to show us certain things. I have a voice. I can ask skeptical questions, and I can write the story the way I wanted to. There was no interference, and so that's what we did.
And how long was this trip?
I think 3 or 4 days.
Wow. And so you surrendered yourself to their security?
Exactly. And I've done this several times where I've done this with the most recently with the Sinaloa drug cartel, where you basically agree that you're going to go in under their auspices with their security, and you're making the bet that there's not much in it for them to harm you because they view you as a tool to get their message out, and you view them as the access to a great story.
And on your team, the ABC team, is there a producer? Is there a cameraman?
Yeah, there were 3 of us, a cameraman and a satellite engineer who was helping us beam our story out of Afghanistan.
Oh, you were able to beam it out each day?
Yeah, we were reporting all live.
Wow. And you must have to have a lot of faith and confidence in your other 2 team members, because this is dicey. And so you have to have a great deal of trust in them too.
Absolutely. And these were both men with quite a bit of combat experience. It was my first experience in a combat zone, but I ended up, spending years of my life after that experience in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Israel, the West Bank, Gaza. I was in Iraq probably for a total of 6 months to a year, off and on over many years of that conflict. And so it just opened up this whole world to me. That is a very complicated and dicey world, but very, very exhilarating and important.
I can see how you get hooked on that world, on that life. But along the way, you did get married. And how does that happen when you're leading the kind of life you are?
You're absolutely right when you use the word hooked. There is a kind of adrenaline junkie aspect to this that created some problems for me. There's no question. I met my wife in 2006. It was a blind date. And the night before I met her, I had just arrived back from Baghdad, and I was super jet lagged on our first date.
Did you stay awake the whole time?
I did. She was compelling. So I began at that age to slow down my coverage of hotspots. And definitely by the time we had a child in 2014, that was off the table. I did do some, the Sinaloa story I talked about was after my son was born, but I wasn't going into active open fire zone.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to the last point you touched on, Sinaloa. Very much in the news lately. We have a new administration. We have a new set of border policies being put into place. If you were covering that story today, how different would it be than from when you did it, say, 8 or 9 years ago?
How different would it be on the ground, you think?
Yeah, for the Sinaloa cartel. Are they bigger? Are they more powerful today? How is the circumstance different? How is it the same?
That's a good question. I'm not quite sure exactly what's changed on the ground, but what is, on a macro sense, what's changed is the intensity of the rhetoric out of Washington vis-a-vis Mexico, not only toward leadership, where there have been threats of tariffs and things like that, but also toward these drug gangs. And so I think we're at a moment where the whole atmosphere is much more charged. And I think it would be, in some ways, riskier to tell the story now, but also more important.
Yeah, I have to believe I don't spend a lot of time in the Southwest, but I have to believe that the Sinaloa cartel's influence isn't stopped at a hard border.
Yeah, and I would say first of all, I agree with that. I don't know the current state of Sinaloa's post El Chapo.
El Chapo 1 and El Chapo 2.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what their post El Chapo 1 rate of influence is, but all of these cartels generally have tentacles that reach into our country, not only for the dissemination of narcotics, but also human trafficking. And so these are pretty horrifying organizations.
If I remember, after the Mexican government raided one of the 12 or 14, I don't remember what the number was, homes that El Chapo had, they confiscated from memory, $21 billion in cash in one home. It was on pallets, shrink wrapped in a half a dozen different currencies. And I thought, if they had sitting around $21 billion in cash in one stash house, never mind what they had in banks secreted around the world or in different, well, how much money were they accumulating? And it's hard to imagine having that kind of resources, how that wouldn't be all corrupting, or at least potentially corrupting, of everyone around them.
Plus one to that, I completely agree. And then I think the other thing that pops up in my mind when I think about how lucrative the drug trade is so what does that tell you? It tells you it's a barometer of human misery, right? That this is a lucrative business because people are looking to numb out and self-medicate. And to me, in many ways, that's the alarming and sad part of the story that we don't often give enough focus to.
But then, so I'm just intrigued by the lifestyle. I know there's a fellow I see once in a while. He's David Engel from NBC News, his dad, and he's been at his job at NBC for a long time. But I could see how you guys who had this special gift and this unbelievable bravery and this mission to tell stories that are important to your communities, your audiences, your stakeholders, how that it's either all in or not. You can't half be in that world, because as the team's packing up to go to another assignment, you're saying, good luck, fellas. The urge to go must be, you either decide I'm still in it or I'm in a different place in my life. Is that basically how it works?
Richard Engel from NBC is,
yeah,
he's remarkable. I knew him back in the day.
I would expect so.
And he really stayed in that line of work in a much more that guy has earned his wings, his stripes, or whatever you want to call it, many times over compared to me. I'm an amateur and got out of the game really early compared to what he's done. And he's managed to do it while having a family and children. And I believe he had a child with some pretty serious special needs. And yeah, so I haven't caught up with him recently, but he's an interesting case study of somebody who's managed to pursue this incredibly interesting and dangerous and risky and important career while maintaining a domestic life.
Which is it's hard to imagine, but I remember one time I had the privilege of introducing for an award Tom Brokaw, and on the committee it was an Irish American event, and on the committee was Pete Hamill, and Pete said, "Jim, would you like me to take a crack at the introduction? Some notes for you?" Yeah. And so I remember I was driving into Manhattan from Long Island with my wife one night, and we had a car service taking us in for dinner. And I had just gotten a fax with Pete's remarks on it. And he calls on the cell phone, and I just finished reading it in the car. He says, "What do you think?" He says, "What changes do you have in mind?" I'm thinking, changes. I'm going to change what Pete Hamill wrote here. No thanks. But what I remembered about his unbelievably beautiful introduction that he wrote for me was he talked about if there was at different points in history, people like you, people like Richard Engel, people like Tom Brokaw, who would bring the world's attention to a story with a camera, a point of view, and a real probing insight. How many things in history would have gone differently? And he talked about Glasnost. And what if there was any and all of you guys on the scene with cameras back then, with the world's attention? How might history have been different? And I remember from that night in the back of a car service reading that, thinking, oh my God, the impact that modern media has on the world and could have had on the world in other circumstances. It's a heavy burden for you in your line of work to realize that you can so influence world history by shining a light on it. Were there moments that you were struck in your career by saying, wow, I am at the center of something very, very important here. I have this enormous responsibility, and am I handling it properly?
Absolutely. I would say for me, the biggest story of my career was the Iraq War, and a real feeling that we were, that America was stumbling into something it didn't understand. And I spent 3 or 4 months on the ground in Iraq before the war, in the final days of Saddam, and really, it just became clear to me that this was not going to go the way the administration was selling it. They weren't going to be greeted by flowers. That this was going to be a mess.
There was that one guy that was dancing. And remember that?
Yes, and banging his shoe against the. Yeah, but there's difference between dancing because you're excited Saddam is gone and dancing because you're excited people from the other side of the planet are going to take over your country.
Yep.
And we mistook the former for the latter. And so I really, I that was a moment where I understood early that I was seeing something historic.
Okay, but let's stop there for a minute, Dan, because I feel so differently all these years later about. I was a supporter of our action then. I bought into the whole thing, and I'm so convinced now that it was a colossal mistake and so much was wasted and lost inappropriately. But that's because I've been a consumer of great journalism, great historical delving since then. If we didn't have a strong and free media, would my mind have changed?
Probably not. It's also a credit to you that you changed your mind, because most people cling to their opinions as if they're their possessions. And I also would say that the failure here may really rest with the media for not having told the story in a way that early on. So in other words, I'm taking responsibility that we didn't tell the story of the likely failure in a compelling enough way to the electorate that people woke up, because I was there. I had a better sense of it, but somehow I didn't convey it, and my colleagues and I didn't convey it strongly enough, or we felt in that kind of jingoistic post 9/11 era that it wasn't safe, or our editors didn't want us to say it a certain way. I don't remember all the details, but it's multifactorial. And then also you had an administration that was willing to lie. And that there was
for apparently the greater good.
Yeah. And I think I was just about to say, I don't think that the Bush administration is unique in American history in its willingness to prevaricate. I just think, and I think that all administrations probably tell themselves the same story, which you just articulated. It's for the greater good.
Yeah. Wow, a witness to history. But Dan, if we could, let's talk a little bit what you shared with us in your first book about how you decided to change your life. Tell us about that life-changing moment for you.
Yeah, so in the middle of my years of covering combat, I I developed some mental health issues that were undiagnosed. So I had an undiagnosed depression that was manifesting in physical symptoms. So I didn't consciously know I was depressed. This would happen when I would come home. Kind of goes back to your comment before about how you get hooked on the adrenaline. I would come home from covering combat, and even though my job at home was very exciting, I was a network news correspondent, sometimes anchoring the news. It was nothing compared to being in these combat zones, and I developed a depression, and I wasn't self-aware enough to know I was depressed, but I was having trouble getting out of bed, and I felt like I had a low-grade fever all the time, and I did something incredibly dumb, which is that I started to self-medicate with recreational drugs, including cocaine, all of which occasioned a panic attack live on Good Morning America in June of 2004, which, if you Google panic attack on television, will be the first result, I believe, for better or worse. And I was not high on the air when that panic attack happened. But afterwards, I went to a shrink, a psychiatrist, who explained that my ambient and rather intermittent use of illicit substances made me more likely to panic in a high tension moment. And so that had a huge impact on my life, and it really, it created a cascade of events that has landed me where I am right now, which is I'm no longer in the news business.
Yeah, and what other things came from that moment for you in terms of self-actualization, self-realization, in terms of where you were? Did you, the psychiatrist, had you been seeing that psychiatrist? Did you decide to continue? Did you say, hey, I can't do this on my own, I need some help here?
Yeah, so I had not been seeing that psychiatrist. I had occasionally gone to a therapist or two along the way, but nobody even asked me whether I was doing drugs. And so I didn't say anything. But then when I had the panic attack, this doctor who my mom found for me very directly said, "Are you doing drugs?" And I said, "Yes." And he's like, "All right, mystery solved. That's what the problem is here." And so the big changes I made immediately were I quit doing drugs. And the second was I agreed to see this doctor once or twice a week. I ended up seeing him, I think, for a decade until he got promoted upstairs at NYU, where he's still an executive. And so a combination of not doing drugs and also actively participating in therapy, that was the first step. But then the really big thing for me came a couple of years into that, where as I started to mature and grow, I got turned on to some of the research into meditation, which at that time, meditation was not very socially acceptable. It had been hot in the 60s, but had really not carried its cultural weight into the 2000s. It was a very niche concern in the 2000s, and I didn't have any interest in it. But I started to see this research that showed that it was really good for stress, anxiety, depression, ADHD, and that it could rewire key parts of your brain. And this was before that research got very well publicized. And I had this entrepreneurial feeling. I use that word deliberately with you. I had this sense, not only is this a story, not only is this an opportunity for me and my mental health, but this is a macro trend that is coming down the pike at us as a species. And I want to be in front of it. And so that was a huge moment for me.
So meditation became an important ingredient in your recovery path of recovery, not just from the use of drugs, but in terms of gaining control of your own psyche, your own emotion. How did you stumble into meditation?
I'm trying to think about how long a version of the story to give you. I'll try to condense it, but I was covering faith and spirituality for ABC News. That was one of my beats.
Interesting beat.
It was an interesting beat. It was assigned to me against my will.
Is that when you met the Dalai Lama?
Yes. Although that was years later. So I was covering this beat for ABC News in between, like, jetting off all over the world. I would also cover faith and spirituality. And
how does that come about? Is that something? Well, I have an interest here, and there's no one else assigned that. And you started doing stories, and all of a sudden it's your beat.
I had an absence of interest. I no interest whatsoever. I sometimes joke that I had a bar mitzvah, but only for money. So I was not at all. I was not at all interested in this stuff. But Peter Jennings, my boss, astutely identified that we live in a very religious country and that we needed a reporter to cover it. And so he encouraged me to do it. And within that beat, I came across a self-help writer by the name of Eckhart Tolle, a very unusual little German man. And Eckhart, in his book's called A New Earth. He's written many books, but that was the book I read. And he talks about how we all have a voice in our heads. We all have this little inner narrator who's yammering at us all day long, kind of chases us out of bed in the morning. And we spend all day just ensorcelled, in this nonstop conversation we're having with ourselves, thinking about the future or the past instead of what's happening right now, judging people, comparing ourselves to other people. It's this constant noise that most of us are unaware of, but that is running our lives. We're just in this inner reactivity, this inner dialogue that is blotting out the sun. And I read that and I was like, yeah, that describes my life, and it describes why I had a panic attack on national television, because I went off to war zones because of the voice in my head telling me it was a good idea. I didn't think about what the consequences would be. I came home, I got depressed. I wasn't self-aware enough to know I was depressed, and then, reflexively reached for the easy solution, in this case, cocaine. And it was such a compelling argument. I then interviewed Eckhart Tolle. He was very frustrating. He didn't have any practical advice to my ear. And it was as a result of that I started hearing about meditation as a way to work with your ego, with the voice in your head, with what's sometimes called the monkey mind, this hypervigilant, racing, eminently distractible,
less rational
inner atmosphere, less rational. Yes.
And so becomes empowered by substances.
Super empowered by substances, super empowered by difficult emotions like anger and anxiety. And it turns out there's this whole art developed over millennia to manage your inner weather. And I got very, very interested in that.
So tell us about your work with meditation today.
Well, so I wrote a book in 2014 called 10% Happier. And the title's a bit of a joke. But it's kind of true. I was trying to counter program against some of the overpromising that I had seen as a reporter in the self-help world.
Yep.
And
which is an enormous world, I've come to learn.
$11 billion a year, I think.
85,000 books number, in print. I mean, it's enormous.
It's huge. It's huge. And there are a lot of hucksters in there, and
there's a lot of good stuff too. But
yes,
there's a big valley between the good and the not so good.
Yes, and I think as a reporter, I was really exposed to many of the hucksters because my job was to expose them, and so I had a bad taste in my mouth having witnessed what I witnessed as a reporter in the self-help world, and I did know from the scientists that there's this ancient technique called mindfulness meditation that has all these beneficial effects, or at least the research strongly suggests that it does. And so I was trying it in my own life, and it was really helping me. And so I wrote a book about it. And that book was way more successful than I thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then I wrote another book about it. It's a catchy title that always helps.
Yes.
And then I started a podcast, and then I started a meditation app. And ultimately, about 3.5 years ago, I quit my job as a news anchor, which I loved. I loved that job, but I have this whole new career in this space. And as I sometimes say, like, I kind of went from, my job used to be to give you bad news, and now my job is to give you good news. And the good news is that your mind and your brain are changeable, are trainable. Happiness is not a factory setting that is unalterable. It's a set of skills.
Well, you said a bit ago, Dan, that meditation gives you the opportunity to rewire your brain. And I lit onto that phrase because I did a book this late last year with a partner who's an extraordinary clinician. His name is Dr. George Everly. He's also become a good friend. And he's a living example of the fact that you can rewire your brain. And indeed, he has rewired his own brain. A quick story about him. He's down at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins and on the medical school faculty as well. He was born in Maryland, small town outside of Baltimore, a little idyllic life, but a horrible student and undiagnosed as ADHD and severely dyslexic. So the quick story there is his dad, who was a successful CPA, was called to the guidance counselor's office when George Everly was in his junior year of high school. And it was suggested by the guidance counselor to George's father that he was going to have a tough time graduating from high school, and let's forget college. It's never going to happen. So you might want to think about taking him out of high school early if you could possibly find him a job in a factory or a filling station, something that he can get a head start before his other classmates graduate, because he's going to need every chance he can get. Why waste his time here? He's not learning anything. And he was told that story by his dad at lunch the day he received his first PhD. And he said to his dad, "Dad, why did you wait all these years to tell me that?" He said, "Because I didn't want that to become self-fulfilling." He talked his way into college, and Larry was diagnosed, and he taught himself how to rewire his brain to use this unbelievable intellect that he has, but not in traditional ways. Meditation has been an important ingredient in his life, but it's one tool in his toolkit of things that he's used to leverage neuroplasticity, the ability of your brain to change, and it's changing all the time. And what I learned from George, what you know now, is that your brain gets better at whatever it does regularly. So if you're really good at worrying, you get better at worrying. If you're really good at getting anxious or anticipating getting anxious, you're going to get better at it. On the other hand, it's harder. You have to be more deliberate. And meditation, I suspect, helps you to be more deliberate, more thoughtful, and not just rote. But if you practice good habits, good mental health habits, you can change and rewire your brain. Does meditation play that kind of an important role in that process?
Absolutely. I mean, I just so strongly, first of all, Dr. Everly sounds like a great guy.
He's an amazing
I just
guy.
wrote down his name. And I just so strongly agree with everything you just said. And I want to hone in on the one turn of phrase in there, which was it's part of a set of skills. I think you said that you can think about happiness or mental health or human flourishing as a set of skills. And there are many modalities. Meditation, there's a bunch of evidence to show that it can help you develop the skill of happiness. But therapy, nature, positive relationships in your life, meaning and purpose at work, exercise, sleep,
relationships,
healthy habits. Relationships are probably, in my reading of the data, the most important variable. And I think, I'm writing a lot about this because this is what my next book is about, that viewing your interpersonal hygiene as a set of skills to develop is incredibly important, especially in the era of AI and
social media, which is I have a lot of contacts, very little depth.
Correct. And look, your business has been built around the notion, to my understanding, as a customer, around the need
to connect, to express.
Yes, the explosive power of interconnection, human connection, and I just think we have devalued it these days, and social media has helped us devalue it. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're at a point of unprecedented anxiety, depression, suicide, addiction, and loneliness.
So exciting place you're at now. What does your career look like today? What are your involvements? What gets you excited?
Yeah.
Where are you going? I
have like 5 or 6 areas that I focus on. So I have my own company now, and
called 10% Happier.
Right now, it's where I'm in a branding. I should talk to you offline about branding. Right now, I have a website which is powered by Substack called danharris.com. I've thought about changing it to 10% happier, but there's a bunch of complexity there that I won't bore you or your listeners with. But so one of the many things I do is a newsletter through Substack and a community where I send out regular newsletters, and I also give my paying subscribers a chance to interact with me, where I do live guided meditations and take people's questions.
Wow.
Another area of involvement for me
And
is,
if people who are interested in that, just go to Substack, type in Dan Harris.
or go to danharris.com.
Okay.
The other big project for me is my podcast, which is called 10% Happier. The third area of involvement for me is writing books. I'm 6.5 years into a sequel to 10% Happier, which is going to be another memoir, which is really about what we were just talking about, the power of relationships. I'm deliberately leaning into the controversial word love, because I think that is the overarching word that describes the various forms of relationships in our lives. And I would say the other area that's kind of related to all of this that I'm also involved in is I do a lot of public speaking, and I really love doing that.
Wow. So you have a pretty full dance card.
I do, but I'm talking to a guy who's got a pretty full dance card himself.
Well, lucky that we can, right?
Lucky that both of us are doing, I know, we don't know each other well, but I could tell, it just shines off of you. I could tell from sitting across from you at dinner how passionate you are about your work. And I think we're very lucky, both of us, to be doing things we love.
Yeah. Look, some people say, well, Dan Harris, you've been so lucky in your life. Yes, indeed you have. But I know a lot of people who've worked almost as hard as you haven't had neither luck, and you seize on it and you create those opportunities by showing up every day and getting back to meditation, because I'm early in my interest. So I want to follow you on that path about learning about meditation. Last September, I was up at an event up at Cambridge that Deepak Chopra put on, called the Sages and Scientists. And at the opening dinner, maybe there's 500 or 600 people in a ballroom, certainly 400 or 500. Deepak did a guided meditation session, and I'm not a meditator, but I want to learn about it. I'm genuinely curious as another ingredient in the possible toolkit. And so I was with my wife. I said, I'm really going to give this a try. She thought I'd be a little bit more skeptical, even though in this big crowded room. And I surrendered to it for the 10 or 15 minutes that we did this. And he just spoke a little bit in the background and guided our thinking. And I had an experience that said to me, there's something here that I want to pursue further in a more serious way. So I'll be first to buy your new book. When can we expect that's coming out?
It's been a very slow process.
It's only 6.5 years, so you got to be nearing the finish line.
I think I am actually kind of nearing the finish line. Best case scenario comes out 2026. To get back to what you were saying about meditation for you, I'm really excited to hear of your interest, and just want to offer myself as somebody who, anytime you want to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about it. And Deepak Chopra comes out of a different school. He's much more influenced by, let's say, I think you would call it Hindu or
Eastern,
Vedic meditation. I come out of Buddhism, and mindfulness meditation, which I talk about a lot, is a secularized version of Buddhist meditation. But both forms, mindfulness and you can call it Hindu or Vedic meditation, both forms of meditation have a significant body of evidence behind them, and they are significantly different from one another, and my understanding confer some different benefits. So, anytime you want to get nerdy about that stuff, I'd be happy to.
I'd be happy to hear so much more about it. Dan, how does, if I'm not violating any personal boundaries here, what role does faith play in your life today?
You're not violating any boundaries. I don't have many guardrails in terms of, I try to be really, really open. faith is so I made that joke about doing the bar mitzvah for money.
No, that wasn't a joke. That's honest.
That was, yes, exactly. Well said. I was raised by atheist scientists. So I constitutionally have a little trouble believing in anything I can't prove or see for myself. Having said that, over time, as I'm now 15 years into meditation, I've developed a much more open mind. And there's a phrase that my meditation teacher, Joseph Goldstein, who's a Menschie, brilliant 80-year-old meditation teacher who is just a huge figure in my life. He talks about a turn of phrase that I think most of us have heard from a guy named Samuel Coleridge, which is the willing suspension of disbelief, meaning just have an open mind. So I don't, maybe Moses parted the Red Sea, or, maybe that's an allegory, or maybe
does it really matter?
Right, exactly. Maybe some of the claims about a God are in all of the various Abrahamic faiths are true. Maybe they're not. Or maybe the experiences you have on ayahuasca with a shaman in Peru tell you something about the nature of the universe, the nature of consciousness. I don't know. And I'm actually reasonably comfortable occupying the zone of not knowing. And I find that actually that's a very thrilling space. And there was in my atheistic past a kind of faith in saying, no, none of this is true. And so I'm much more now in a receptive mode of, yeah, maybe rebirth is true. Maybe some of the claims in the New or Old Testament are true. I don't, who am I? I don't know. And I will say that specifically within Buddhism, and I have a deep interest in Buddhism, which, just to be clear, can be practiced both as a faith and as a just kind of a recipe for living. Yeah. And I'm much more in the latter category. But within Buddhism, the word faith really is translated as confidence that this practice works. And with meditation, because it's not like exercise where you're going to see, sweat and soreness really right away, you have to have some faith or confidence that it's worth investing in this. And so I do, the deeper I go into the Dharma or the Buddhism, the more faith and confidence that I have that there's something here. And that gives me a sense of like, oh yeah, I'm not going to take the metaphysical claims on faith, but I'm going to have some openness to maybe these guys who develop these brilliant meditation techniques are onto something.
Yeah, as I get older, and that good news is I'm still getting older. Hopefully I get a little wiser. That'll happen someday. But it's a question that's very much on my mind in our writing and podcast work. This spring, I'm excited. We're going to do some really interesting and deep probes around faith and end of life and attitudes about afterlife, how the art community has treated the afterlife throughout history. I'm really getting turned on by this subject. But in my social community, my friends, those among my friends, it used to be like your parents. I thought science debunks all of this. But some of the smartest people I know I most respect for their intellect, also have a deep and a very apparent faith, which gives them an inner strength that I really admire and wish I had a better sense. So I think I need to commit personally to being more exploratory about faith and its impacts, so that I make sure I give it a fair shake, so to speak. But I applaud the fact that you're brave in your journey and have changed your mind on so many things.
Yeah, and I mean, I applaud you for doing these explorations.
But you used to do it, and you got paid for it.
Exactly. I still get paid to do it, which I have some misgivings about. But I love what a great way to make a living.
I love the mix of things that you're involved in, and you mentioned that one of the things you're doing is public speaking. I would imagine I'll go out of my way to find a time you're doing a public address to see. I think you'd be fantastic. And if someone wanted to engage with you, find out about engaging with you, they just go to danharris.com?
Yeah, that's where pretty much everything is.
Yeah. Well, Dan, we're excited to see in 2026, no later, the next iteration of 10% Happier and what it evolves to. I imagine it's going to be just as interesting. But what an interesting and nice man you are, smart, brave, self-reflecting, honest. You're the real deal. I sensed it when we met across the table. You were hanging around with some really good and thoughtful people who I think the world of. Brendan McGuire was the person who invited me that night, and I think he's just an absolutely fabulous young man. But he hangs around with good peeps, and you're certainly one of them. And I was thrilled to meet you, and so happy that we had a chance to chat today. So I look forward to staying president of a local chapter of your fan club and watching all the good work you do.
Thank you, sir. I'm a huge admirer of the work you've done in your life, and I do want to just reiterate that as you continue to explore in this space, if I can be a resource to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Thanks, Dan Harris of danharris.com. We look forward to visiting again sometime soon.